Why a Boy Became Pope and Started a Deadly Feud. In the year 1032, the city of Rome was a cauldron of power and ambition. Noble families vied for dominance, and the church was their battleground. Among these families, the most ruthless was the Theophylacti, a powerful dynasty with a hunger for control. But as they plotted in their grand villas, a whispered name echoed through the dark corridors: Benedict. And not just any Benedict, a boy. Benedict was barely 12 years old, a child in robes too large for him, with wide, frightened eyes. But his family saw something else, a perfect puppet. To them, he wasn't a boy, but a tool, a pawn in a deadly game of power. His uncle, Alberic III, was the head of the family, a man who ruled with an iron fist and a cold heart. Alberic had schemed for years, bribing, threatening, and whispering in the ears of cardinals. And now his plan was clear. Rome itself was a fractured city. On one side, the nobility, rich and powerful, who saw the papacy as their personal prize. On the other, the common people, hungry, desperate, and ignored. But none of this mattered to Alberic. He saw only one thing: his family on the throne of St. Peter. The day of the election was a stormy one, thunder crashing over the ancient city. Inside the Lateran Palace, the cardinals gathered, some old and bent with age, others sharp-eyed and cunning. But most were bought, their loyalty stained with Alberic's gold. When the vote was cast, it was a farce, a show. And when the name was announced, Benedict IX, the child in the oversized robes, was hoisted up, bewildered, his feet barely touching the ground. But outside, whispers turned to roars. A boy? A child as pope? The streets buzzed with disbelief. Some laughed, others cursed, but the worst was yet to come. Because a boy may wear the robes, but he cannot wield the power. And in the shadows of Rome, those who had been wronged, those who had been cast aside, were already sharpening their knives. And so the feud began. The streets of Rome were restless. Benedict IX, barely more than a child, sat on the throne of St. Peter, but it was his uncle Alberic who wielded true power. The boy was a prisoner of the papal palace, surrounded by whispering priests and scheming nobles. Each day he was dressed in the finest robes, led through rituals he barely understood, and paraded before the faithful. But when the doors closed, he was just a lonely boy. Yet the city around him was a boiling cauldron. Those who had been passed over, the noble families who felt cheated, fumed in their palaces. Among them, the Crescenti family, rivals of the Theophylacti, plotted in darkened halls. Their patriarch, Crescentius, an old bitter man with silver hair and a venomous tongue, refused to bow to a child pope. He saw an opportunity, a way to bring down Alberic's dynasty and seize power for himself. Rumors began to spread. They whispered of the boy's illegitimacy, of Alberic's corruption, of pagan rituals within the palace walls. Murmurs of rebellion simmered beneath the surface. Crescentius gathered allies, sowing seeds of discord, bribing the disillusioned and arming the desperate. But inside the palace, young Benedict was changing. He was no longer the frightened child of his coronation. He grew restless, angry. His uncle's tight grip felt like a chokehold, and the whispers he overheard spoke of betrayal. The boy pope became defiant, challenging priests, questioning orders, and even sneaking out into the city under disguise. One night, beneath the flickering light of torches, Benedict slipped into the slums of Rome. He saw the starving beggars, the sick huddled in the alleys, the fury in the eyes of those who cursed his name. But he also saw something else: power. A different kind of power. Not the gold and silk of the palace, but the raw, desperate force of the people. And when he returned to the palace that night, mud on his sandals, a new fire burned in his eyes. But Benedict was not the only one who had changed. Crescentius had made his move. The attack came without warning. Crescentius and his men struck in the dead of night. A dozen shadowed figures slipped through the narrow alleys of Rome, their swords glinting beneath the moonlight. Their target, the Lateran Palace, the boy pope's residence. But this was no siege. It was an assassination. A guard at the gate was the first to fall, his throat slashed before he could shout. Another stabbed through the back as he turned. The assassins moved like shadows, swift and silent, slipping through the palace's outer defenses. They had bribed some of the guards, and the rest were too few to stop them. Inside, Benedict was woken by the clash of steel, the muffled screams. He stumbled from his bed, his heart hammering. He was only a boy, but he was about to learn the price of power. His uncle Alberic burst into the chamber, his face a mask of rage and fear. "They're here! They're here for you!" he hissed, grabbing the boy and shoving him toward a hidden passage. "Run, Benedict! Run!" But even as they fled, the screams grew louder. Flames licked at the walls. Crescentius's men had set fire to the outer halls. The palace was becoming a furnace. Smoke filled the air, choking the corridors. Benedict's eyes burned, his chest tightened. He stumbled, but Alberic's grip was iron. Benedict ran through the labyrinth of Rome, his breath ragged, his legs trembling. Flames danced in the distance, the palace burning. His uncle was dead, but Benedict was not safe. Hunted by Crescentius's men, the boy learned to survive. Beggars hid him, thieves taught him shadows, and in the darkness he grew. No longer a frightened child, but a young man with a burning desire for revenge. But Benedict did not remain a shadow. He became a symbol. His name spread in whispers, not as a boy pope, but as a young warrior in exile. Disgraced nobles, bitter priests, and those who had suffered under Crescentius joined him. Rome was divided, a city of whispers and blades. Benedict's followers struck in the night, raiding Crescentius's estates, burning his grain stores, and freeing those imprisoned by his rule. Each strike was a message. Benedict was alive, and he was coming. But he was not just a boy seeking vengeance. He was learning strategy, diplomacy, the art of power, and soon he would not just be a fugitive. He would be a conqueror. Rome trembled. Crescentius, once the hunter, now felt hunted. His allies whispered of betrayal. His soldiers feared the shadows. Benedict's name was a curse and a battle cry. But Crescentius was not without his own strength. He fortified his strongholds, executed suspected traitors, and placed a bounty on Benedict's head. But his paranoia made him cruel, and his cruelty bred hatred. And so the city waited. A knife's edge drawn between a boy who had become a warrior and a tyrant who feared his own shadow. Crescentius, once the hunter, now felt hunted. His allies whispered of betrayal. His soldiers feared the shadows. Benedict's name was a curse and a battle cry. And though the boy pope had been shaped by darkness, he had become something more, a warrior with the cunning of a serpent. Crescentius, once the puppet master, now became the prisoner of his own paranoia. His hands shook as he wrote orders, demanding the arrest of anyone who spoke Benedict's name. His once loyal captains eyed each other with suspicion, and his fortresses became cages. Fires burned in the streets, and the citizens of Rome whispered of an unstoppable force rising against the tyrant. For Benedict was no longer just a boy. He was a legend in the making, a name whispered in the alleys, and a shadow that struck fear into his enemies. But Crescentius was not without his own strength. He fortified his strongholds, executed suspected traitors, and placed a bounty on Benedict's head. His men patrolled the streets with drawn swords, and his spies filled the taverns, listening for any whisper of rebellion. Yet his paranoia made him cruel, and his cruelty bred hatred. Citizens who had once supported him turned against him. Even the church, which had once tolerated his brutal rule, began to see him as a threat. Priests disappeared in the night, their bodies found hanging from the city walls, a warning to those who dared defy him. But for every ally Crescentius crushed, two more rose in secret. Benedict's name became a beacon of hope, a promise of vengeance against the tyrant, and in the darkness, a plan was forming. The storm that had gripped Rome only grew worse. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the earth, but within the city's walls the real storm was human. Crescentius, desperate to crush the growing rebellion, sent his soldiers to hunt Benedict's followers. Homes were burned, families dragged into the streets. The screams of the innocent filled the night, but the boy Pope, now a shadow in the chaos, struck back. His loyalists, disguised as simple merchants and priests, moved through the city like whispers. They poisoned Crescentius's food supplies, set his watchtowers ablaze, and slipped daggers between the ribs of his guards. Crescentius's fear became madness. He saw enemies in every shadow, betrayal in every glance. His trusted captains whispered of abandoning him, and his fortress, once a place of power, became a tomb of fear. And then, on the darkest night, Benedict made his move. Guided by his most loyal warriors, men who had followed him from the start, he struck at the heart of Crescentius's power. The gates of the tyrant's stronghold were thrown open, and chaos erupted. Crescentius's soldiers, weary and terrified, fought without hope. Benedict, now a young man forged in the fires of struggle, led the charge himself. His sword flashed in the torchlight, and his voice rang out above the battle. "Rome is not yours to bleed," he shouted, and his followers answered with a roar. Crescentius, cornered in his grand hall, drew his blade, but his hands shook. He was no warrior, only a tyrant who had lost his soul to fear. And when Benedict's blade struck him down, the cheers of the people drowned out his final gasp. The tyrant was dead. But Benedict's victory was not the end of the struggle. Rome had been scarred, its streets stained with blood, its people divided, and the boy Pope, who had once been a pawn, now stood alone at the center of a broken city. His loyalists hailed him as a savior, but the church saw him as a threat. Diplomats whispered of a dangerous precedent, a boy who had defied his masters, seized power by force, and ruled with a fist of iron. Yet, as Benedict stood atop the blood-stained walls, the wind tugging at his robes, he spoke not of vengeance, but of peace. "We have shed enough blood," he declared, his voice steady. "Rome must be a city of faith, not fear." And so, the boy who had been forced into the throne became a leader by his own will. But his story was not one of triumph, but of transformation. A boy shaped by darkness, who had risen to become a legend. A legend born in blood, forged in fire, and remembered as a warning. If one day someone ever told you about the boy who became Pope, who rose against tyranny, and who fought to save a city drowning in chaos, remember this: power does not change a person. It reveals who they truly are. But Benedict's rise was not just the tale of a boy turned warrior. It was a mirror held up to the corrupt heart of the church itself. A boy became Pope because powerful men needed a puppet, a figure they could control. Yet in their arrogance, they forgot that even a child, once given power, could learn to wield it. His papacy was a symptom of a greater sickness, a church consumed by greed, where faith had become a currency and power was a poison. Benedict's story is not just about his rise and his bloody feud with Crescentius. It is a story of how innocence can become a weapon, how corruption can give birth to tyranny, and how a single misguided decision can plunge an entire city into chaos. Rome did not tremble because a boy wore the papal crown. It trembled because the men who placed it on his head believed they could control fate. And when they failed, the blood of the innocent flowed in the streets. Remember this: power can shape a person, but it can also unmask them. The story of the boy Pope is a warning A warning that faith without wisdom is a trap, that ambition without honor is a curse, and that even the purest soul, when touched by power, can become a storm. Rome burned not just because of a boy, but because of the greed of those who sought to use him. If one day someone ever told you about the boy who became pope, who rose against tyranny, and who fought to save a city drowning in chaos, remember this. It was never just his story. It was the story of a world where the powerful turned faith into a weapon and reaped the whirlwind.